hostile nation states wanting to exert influence on our country, sometimes I think we're tempted to think about that problem in terms of, a really Hollywood-esque sort of way of thinking, like planes coming in and invading our country, even though we have in recent days had incursions into our airspace, which are, sort of proves my point further. Some of the big ways that our national sovereignty has been threatened is by a lack of legal framework and tools that prevent hostile state actors from influencing our economy in a negative way. And what I mean by that are things like being able to purchase major components of Canada's natural resources, particularly critical minerals like lithium. Even when we look at hostile state actors being able to own intellectual property on really important things to protecting national sovereignty in the future, like, let's say, quantum computing. We have a duty in this place to ensure that nations that do not share our values and in fact show hostility and aggression and a desire to erode Canada's sovereignty, we have to put in place safeguards to prevent them. So today, Speaker, we're debating a bill that I think what this Liberal government has done with this bill is they're trying to distract Canadians. They're trying to say, like, oh, here's a bill that might do some things, but it really doesn't get to the heart of the fact that, as I've said, the world has changed, and we need to have very strong protections, given that the world has changed, to ensure that our sovereignty is protected in terms of hostile state actors influencing our economy, or in fact, even taking resources, intellectual property, other things, back to their nations that could in turn be used to threaten our country and the people that we all represent. I don't think this bill is adequate at all. And I want to talk about why and what the government should be doing to protect our sovereignty in terms of these economic measures. So, first of all, what this bill does is, right now, if a state-owned enterprise, and what I mean, Speaker, by that is a company that's owned in part or wholly by another government, another country, wants to buy, let's say, a mine or something like that, that transaction should be subject to a review, both in terms of national security and in terms of whether or not this transaction is in the benefit of the best interest of Canadians. So what this bill wants to do is take away sort of the weak process that exists right now, the inadequate process that exists right now, and instead of having it go through a cabinet process where there's people from across the country, different portfolios, different lenses looking at this, put all that power into one minister. And I have a big concern with this government, given what they did with SNC-Lavalin. When the Prime Minister was confronted with a cabinet minister that did her job and said, whoa, I'm not doing this, he just shunted her aside and replaced her with a minister that was more acquiescent. And I am very hesitant to give this government, and particularly this Prime Minister, power to, let's say he's under influence from other nations or lobbying influence or whatever, as we saw in the SNC-Lavalin scandal. If he is faced with that type of pressure again, I don't think he's got the chops to stand firm in the best interests of Canadians, because he's proven otherwise. And this bill, the fact that it doesn't go to cabinet, I think it waters down the process, and that should be of grave concern to all Canadians. Certainly that should be an amendment that's considered to remove that process. It should go to cabinet. I can't understand why it wouldn't. The other thing is that this bill, because the world has changed, we know that there are countries and state actors that employ this type of capital, like these state-owned enterprises, to try and purchase major parts of the Canadian economy. There's a really high threshold, like in terms of dollar value, for what would trigger a review under the current process. For certain countries, I feel that threshold should be zero. There are some countries that we know are acting against the interests of Canadians, arguably, that are challenging our sovereignty. And for those countries, anytime they want to buy up some of our critical resources or our critical intellectual property, there should be an automatic review, an automatic national security review, an automatic review on if this is in the best interests of the country or not, so that we as parliamentarians and the government can show accountability to our constituents, that we're not just letting countries be hostile to our country by buying up parts of it. So I think that that threshold should be 0, and I think that that should be amended in this bill as well, too. The last thing is I think there should be a list of countries that have shown aggression and hostility to this country or to our allies, wherein there's automatically a review. So if you're on this list, there's automatically a review for this type of transaction. I think that should also be an amendment in this bill. The other thing is the bill doesn't talk about, it talks about just looking at acquisitions of companies. It's not looking at the acquisition of assets. And what I mean by that, for someone who's listening, I know there's been a lot of concerns about certain countries that have been hostile to Canada buying up things like farmland in Canada, or buying up critical mines that produce things like lithium. And this is, of course, a substance that is used in really important things like batteries. And it's a really rare earth mineral. It's important that we retain sovereignty of that. If these hostile state actors are trying to avoid scrutiny by our government through a backdoor by just, avoiding scrutiny, it should be an asset review. The last thing I'm going to say is, and just to circle back on why I don't think power should be consolidated in the hands of the minister, this week our ethics commissioner said that the title of this article is "The Act has been there for 17 years, for God's sake." And he talks about essentially the Prime Minister and the Cabinet and a lot of members in the Liberal Party not having a moral compass to know what's right and wrong, and not holding their Cabinet to account and letting this leader continue. That's why this bill needs to be amended, because there's too much power concentrated in a group of people who think that they can get away with things that are in their best interest. And when we're talking about maintaining national sovereignty, we need more safeguards, not less, on these types of economic transactions. In closing, I want to talk about what my colleague said from Saskatchewan said. This morning there was a report that said that the Chinese Communist Party was directly influencing our elections here in Canada. Our sovereignty is under threat. And we should be ensuring through strict safeguards and acknowledging that the world has changed, that our constituents deserve greater levels of protection in terms of looking at how assets might be produced or taken from Canada and potentially used against us in the future, not less. And I'm worried that because this bill does so little and it actually waters down that fiduciary authority of Cabinet to look at these transactions, that we're putting ourselves in a more precarious position as opposed to a stronger position, particularly given the ethical lapses of this government and particularly given the lack of ability of the Liberal backbench to stand up and hold their ministers who give contracts to their friends. The Prime Minister's had 2 ethics violations. How is he still the leader of their party, right? Because that lack of moral compass that the Ethics Commissioner talked about, there needs to be amendment to this bill. Thank you, Speaker.